The following Ardelyx podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and cannot be considered as medical advice. Please speak to a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Gut Matters podcast. I'm Johanna Ruddy. I'm Senior Director of Patient Advocacy here at Ardelyx, and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Andrea Shin. And today we are really excited to welcome a really special guest, and that is Dr. Laura Williams. I just really love Dr. Laura. She is just such a lovely human and a wonderful resource for patients and for providers. And I'm so excited to talk to her today about patient advocacy and why it matters in everything that we do. But before we delve into this conversation with Dr. Laura, I wanted to give her a proper introduction. So she has a really lovely and long CV. So we're going to summarize it today, Dr. Laura. But Dr. Laura Williams has served as Ardelyx's Chief Patient Officer since 2025, having joined the company in November of 2020 as the Senior Vice President of Global Therapeutic Strategies and Patient Advocacy. And then she was later promoted to the Chief Medical Officer for Ardelyx in 2021. Laura is a life science enterprise leader with extensive experience as a pharmaceutical drug developer, healthcare policy advisor, patient advocate, and portfolio strategist. She's an accomplished research-oriented physician scientist and board member who is committed to discovering, developing, and commercializing innovative therapies that address unmet medical need. I'm going to skip a lot of her background. She has 25 plus years in pharmaceutical industry, and she earned her Bachelor's of Science degree from Mississippi State University, a Doctor of Medicine degree from the University of Iowa, and a Master of Public Health degree in epidemiology from the University of Washington, where she also completed a clinical fellowship in infectious disease and completed her internal medicine residency at the University of Michigan, where she also is the chief resident and junior faculty. Welcome, Dr. Laura. How are you?
Oh my God. Thank you, Johanna. Welcome to you as well. Thanks for having me. And thanks for that little long introduction.
Yes, you have been a very busy lady and deserve all the accolades for such a wonderful career. I am so excited to talk to you today because your heart and my heart are linked around patient advocacy. And I remember very clearly meeting you for an interview in the lobby of a hotel at DDW for coffee, and you sharing, the importance of advocacy and how you were the first director of advocacy for Ardelyx early on, and how much that meant to you and what that means to you personally. So I can't wait to dig into all of that today. But I'd love to just start with, your background as a physician. Being both an MD and going back and getting that master's in public health. I guess my first question is, how did that dual perspective shape your early career? Because I think public health perspective as a physician really can help you see things like social determinants of health that really can drive chronic illness and access issues and all of those things. So how did all of that drive and help your perspective early on as a physician?
No, that's a great question, Johanna. I think, for me, it was the decision to, pursue medicine was something that I made very early on in life. And once I did that and knew that, I wanted to, be an internist, I think the next decision was really whether or not I was going to subspecialize in something else. And so when I made that decision to do my subspecialty in infectious diseases, University of Washington also had a Master's of Public Health program connected to a number of the infectious diseases initiatives. And so for me, it made a lot of sense. When I think about these little microorganisms wreaking so much havoc, and then marrying that with public health to understand sort of from whence they come, how they travel, just understanding the epidemiology of infectious diseases was really fascinating for me. And I think you're right. As time has progressed, it has also allowed me to really understand a lot better some of the social determinants of health. As you track diseases, for example, in different patient populations, you also track, sort of, again, the demographics, the epidemiology of it, the social determinants of health. I think one of the other nice things about this career evolution is that, while we have the known and character, the very common social determinants of health, it's also interesting that policy, healthcare
Mhm.
policy, can also become one of those social determinants of health, particularly if it leads to less than optimal outcomes.
At Ardelyx, we're dedicated to improving the lives of patients by discovering, developing, and commercializing first-in-class medicines that advance care to patients with unmet medical needs. Learn more about us at ardelyx.com.
So you started your academic path, getting your doctorate or your Doctor of Medicine degree at the University of Iowa. What was that like? Tell us a little bit about what that was like. And I know, and maybe we can preview for our listeners, your background, where you grew up, how that all
Yeah.
kind of got you to that place.
Yeah, that's an interesting, that's a very interesting story. I mean, I grew up the youngest of 14 in rural Mississippi. And so it was quite a jump, obviously, moving around the country as I embarked on my career. But, I went to undergraduate at Mississippi State. And I grew up, as I said, in the South.
Yeah.
The climate, all of those things, something I was very used to. I'll tell you, there was a huge culture shock when I went to Iowa City, to start my medical education. It was a great time, though. It's a wonderful institution. Obviously, learned a ton, but just little things like getting used to the weather
Yeah, sure.
was a huge venture in and of itself. But again, it was an amazing time, and I think what it taught me, I had always wanted to do something that would lead me back to the community, from which I came.
Right.
And clearly, Iowa City was very different from, rural Mississippi. But I think, the commonalities is that, the diseases that we aim to treat don't have any. I mean, obviously, some of them can be, attached to certain demographics, but for the most part, when you look at common diseases like hypertension and diabetes and, heart disease,
Right.
there you find them everywhere. And I think at the end of the day, I was able to, learn and study and do these things that would make a difference. I think later on as I transition into the pharmaceutical industry. So it was a wonderful time. I mean, again, um, probably more in retrospect than when I was going through it, but
Probably.
um,
Yeah.
but it was a good time. It was a very enjoyable time.
I know that in your journey working in infectious disease, you really started working closely with the HIV patient population. And this was in the 80s when it was really a huge public health concern and problem. And I'd love to get a little bit of information from you around that. And I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like that's when the idea of advocacy really like made itself real to you with the patients that you were serving at that time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, as a physician, I had always felt like I was advocating for patients, right? But I think it was really the infectious diseases fellowship, and actually started even in residency, at the height of the HIV epidemic. And I will say that, the internal medicine residency at Michigan helped me hone my skills in terms of, how best to serve patients. And what do I mean? One of the things that I really took to heart was active listening, actually listening to hear and understand as opposed to respond. And I think that serves you well because patients want to be heard. They need to be heard. I think the other thing that, was really important for me was this concept of empathy. I could see myself or, those that I loved in the same shoes as I saw my patients. And so it was easy to want the best for my patients. And so I always thought I was a patient advocate, but it wasn't until I went to University of Washington, again, height of the HIV epidemic. In the first year, it was just dismal in terms of just, success rates, right? Because we only had AZT. And so it was a universally fatal disease. But by the time I was a third year fellow, we started to get some of the protease inhibitors, different drugs, different mechanisms of action. We started to get those for compassionate use. And you've heard me tell this story, Johanna. I mean, long story short, I, had a patient that I had admitted to hospice because we had done pretty much everything we could. But when I got this drug for compassionate use, I tried it on him and he got so much better. Like his viral load went to undetectable, his CD4 cells improved, and they kicked him out of hospice. And I had to help him find an apartment. And I had never seen anything like that ever, right? And so for me, that was transformational. I mean, people use that word a lot, but that was truly transformational. That was my penicillin moment. And I wanted to know at that point, how do these drugs come to be? Because it's not something that you're taught in medical school. It's not something that is really promoted during residency. And so I just wanted to know, and that's really the evolution of me, sort of transitioning from the academic world to the pharmaceutical industry.
That's, I mean, it's great to hear about your journey and your story. I think it's really so fascinating because clearly I feel like very early on you had this connection to the concept of, offering humanistic care and seeing patients as people, being able to relate to them within, your own world, connecting them to friends and family. And another interesting thing I heard just from your story is that it seemed like you had this innate curiosity early on. And so I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about that. And it seems to probably tie into your transition. And so, I understand that you spent nearly 2 decades at a large pharmaceutical company after you left full-time clinical practice. And I'm interested to hear, what was that transition from clinical practice to drug development like? And, what are some of the key lessons that you did learn about, how these drugs came to market? And it seems a lot of that was even motivated by your personal experiences with patients.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Andrea. I think for me, the transition it was sort of bittersweet, and I had to do it in a very sort of methodical way. And what do I mean by that? You know, uh, I was fortunate enough to continue to be able to see patients outside of the pharmaceutical industry piece. So I continued to serve as an attending physician at one of the local hospitals in Chicago for about 5 years during my initial, tenure at Abbott. And that was great because it was only, it was serving as attending 1 month out of a year, but it afforded me the opportunity to continue to connect with patients and teach residents, which is something that I absolutely loved. I mean, as a chief resident at Michigan, one of the things that I loved the most was really the opportunity to sort of teach future physicians. And so I think for me that transition was important, making sure that I could continue to do that. But at some point, you realize you can't do both, right? And so I think for me, that was the right amount of balance that allowed me to fully engage in the industry. Um, and what I also realized from the whole HIV experience is that, I could see 10 patients in my morning clinic. Um, as an HIV specialist. But if I were able to actually work on some of these new HIV drugs, I could potentially help patients all over the world. And so this came to fruition. Like I went to the first AIDS conference in South Africa as a pharmaceutical, physician. And so I think it was the ability to sort of see all of what a physician could do in lots of different spaces that got me comfortable with the whole transition into industry. Like we are all doing things, I think, at the end of the day, to help patients, and you can do it wherever you sit. And I think that realization really was what was most essential. I think in terms of me, you know. Being successful in pharma. I think the other piece, and I'll be quick here, is that once I got into the pharmaceutical industry and learned drug development, I became agnostic to therapeutic area. So I didn't just do infectious diseases. I worked in women's health, for example, in endometriosis and uterine fibroids. I worked in the kidney disease space. I worked in the cardiovascular space. And I think it was that sort of um, buffet of different experiences that allowed me to understand that wherever you are, um, the patients are waiting. There's unmet need across the board, and um, you can actually serve patients wherever you sit.
I think that's so important. I think as clinicians, especially in current modern day, we're so fortunate to have access to a lot of therapeutics, especially over decades of research and, understanding how that comes to be. And, as a physician, for you to be able to recognize there are different levels at which you can impact patient care, that's just such a cool opportunity. One, question that I had about this, because I do think a lot of patients and clinicians probably don't have a lot of knowledge about the complexity of clinical trials and regulatory processes, is that I'm assuming, you must have learned a lot about that during your journey, and just, overall what that kind of effort is like, or what you've learned about that whole process in general.
Yeah, no, it's a very highly regulated industry, right? I mean, one of the most regulated industries, and for good reason, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you're offering, a treatment or a device or something that is supposed to, help patients. You want to make sure that it is both safe and efficacious, and that it has a tolerability, that is also acceptable. And so um, it makes sense that it's that regulated. And yes, uh, it's an interesting process. I think when you look at it from start to finish, it always should be looked at through the lens of the patient, from the beginning to the end, right? From a discovery standpoint, what is it that you're actually trying to solve? Is it the fact that the current therapies are not safe enough, or they're not as effective as they could be? Is it that, there's a high pill burden and you need a different, formulation? Is it that you need, um, to do studies in kids so that you can address that unmet need? And so you ask that question even at the beginning, at the very beginning, and that way your discovery scientist can say, okay, maybe we need this to be once a day as opposed to 3 times a day, and how can we come up with the best formulation that will deliver that, right? And so once you do that, as you know, I mean, before you go in humans, you need to do a whole battery of safety tests in animals to make sure that there are no, big red flags or huge signals there. And once you get that, and it's interesting because when you look at that whole process, it's got a high failure rate, right? I mean, out of every 10 drugs that you try to, develop, only one gets across the finish line. And so it's a very regulated, very methodical process. once you've done the animal studies and you get the green light from the regulatory authorities, you then go into patients, usually healthy volunteers first, because you want to see, how the body handles the drug. Then you go into actual patients who have the disease that you aim to treat, and you look at it, from a safety, efficacy standpoint. And eventually you amass enough data, hopefully, to convince the regulatory authorities to approve the drug. But patients are involved all the way through. You have to have gotten their input in terms of how you design your clinical trials. You have to have gotten their input in terms of what their actual needs are. You have to have gotten their input in terms of what actually matters from a quality of life standpoint, right? It's fine to do these studies that have, primary endpoints that are mandated by the agency, by the regulatory authority. But you also have to ask the question, what matters most to the patient, right? We often say, what is your most bothersome symptom, right? And so you have to have gotten input along the way by the patients. And guess what? Even when you get to the finish line, you have to have the patient's voice come out to say, it's one thing to have reams of clinical data that show that your drug is safe and effective, but it's altogether another thing to have a patient say, I need this drug because there is an unmet need. And so I think what I have loved about this experience is that, throughout it all, the patient is still weaved throughout every process of it. And then when you get to commercialization, I mean, we have patient advisory committees where we actually ask our patients, what do you think about this? Does this resonate with you? Is this something that would make you interested in, talking to your doctor? So I think it's a very interesting process. It's a highly regulated space. Um, but at the end of the day, the patient and his or her story has to be captured all the way through. Otherwise, you're developing things that don't even matter to patients. You need to make sure that what you're actually aiming to fix, right, to help, is actually doing just that.
Yeah, it's listening to this, it's really clear to me that your approach and your passion for drug development is very much anchored in patient advocacy, and how that is such an important theme in terms of why we do what we do, and why these trials exist, and even from asking the right question. So as the former CEO and now CPO at Ardelyx, you've been deeply involved in the science and development of therapies, especially for renal and GI diseases. How do you feel like your experience informs your work as a leader in leading these teams?
Yeah, so former CMO to CPO. Yes, I think that that whole transition, so I've spent the bulk of my career actually developing drugs, so doing clinical drug development. And I've been fortunate enough to work, as I said, across a number of different therapeutic areas and see a number of drugs cross the finish line and get to patients. I think that, what I have learned through that experience is just patient centricity is not just the right thing to do. It's actually a win-win for everybody. It should be a business model. And what do I mean by that? I mean, for every dollar that we spend in patient engagement, for example, that creates up to $500 of value that can be reinvested into additional development efforts. We know that if we engage patients in terms of clinical trial design and input, that we can actually shorten the length of time that we actually have to do clinical studies. We know if we gather real world evidence now, that is something not only that the agency wants to see, but they use it and can use it positively in terms of getting your drug across the finish line. So it's the right thing to do. But I will say this, I think my own personal experience as a patient myself really has guided that evolution and transition as well. I mean, I live in Boston, some of the best hospitals, in the world. And when I had my health scare about 5 years ago, um, it was so extremely difficult to navigate the healthcare system. And that's for me as a physician who knows the language, knows the lingo, know the questions to ask, all of those things. And so it made me ponder, what does the average patient actually have to go through? I didn't see it through that lens necessarily, simply as a physician, or even simply as a pharmaceutical drug developer, but seeing it through the lens of the patient. As a patient myself, really made it hit home. And so I think for me, this concept of operationalizing empathy is where you start. I mean, from a patient advocacy standpoint, if you can see yourself in that patient, if you can see um, your loved one in that patient, how can you not, come at them from a place of extreme empathy and care? Like, you want the best possible outcome for that patient. And so I think it's been a series of those things, so as a physician, as an advocate, but then also as a patient as well.
Yeah, I just love everything about that, what you just said. And I know you and I share a love of Dr. Brene Brown as well, and her teachings on the power of empathy and vulnerability and how powerful that is in leadership at all levels, and particularly applying to patient care. I think that's awesome. Laura, what was it about the chief patient officer role that made you say, we have to have this at Ardelyx, and I want to move into this role? This is important for the company. Like, what did you have, like a light bulb moment that was like, okay, this is not just, you said it's good for business, it's good for patients. What was that impetus?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think Ardelyx, and obviously I'm a little bit biased here, but is an amazing company. And when I think about, the accomplishments that the company writ large has made just over, the last, 5 to 10 years, it is amazing. And so for me, again, this was right after my health scare that the CEO approached me and asked if I would come in and lead patient advocacy. And again, having had that healthcare scare, I felt like every patient should have their own personal advocate. If they are not able to self advocate, they need to have somebody with them. And so I was like, yes, yes, I want to do this. And as soon as that happened and I joined the company, shortly thereafter, maybe a year into it, I was asked to step in as the chief medical officer, just to help us get over, some internal hurdles that we needed to overcome. And we did that. We were able again to get another drug across the finish line. And I think it was that experience that let me know that it's one thing to get a drug approved, it's yet another thing to make sure that patients have access. So then I spent the next couple of years, advocating on the Hill for equitable access to all patients for innovative therapies. And so I think for me, it was the evolution to the CPO role was really a timing thing. Having done the couple of things that I really wanted to do as a chief medical officer, it was time to go back to why I actually joined the company, which was patient advocacy. And so when the CEO and I, Mike, started to talk about the next steps, I think we both agreed that we wanted to amplify the patient's voice here at Ardelyx. We wanted to make sure that it was embedded into every function, right? And to do that, it was Mike's idea to elevate the position to chief patient officer. Again, what better way to amplify the voice, but to also highlight our commitment
Yeah.
to patients? And so it was a no-brainer for me. Like having, done nothing but clinical drug development for, almost 25, 30 years, to move into a space now that is solely dedicated to making sure that the patient voice, that this concept of patient centricity is woven throughout our culture. I can't think of a more exciting opportunity. I love it, and so it was a no brainer.
Well, I see the joy in your face when you talk about advocacy. Like you light up. I know this is your passion and your heart, and I know that this is the right fit for you at this time. So I'm so excited. Obviously, I'm biased as well, but I love working with you, Laura.
Likewise, the feeling is completely mutual. I mean, you have taught me so much in your short time here about how we can impact patients and how we interface with them. I mean, you have your sense of curiosity in terms of what patients are asking for, what they need, and how can we provide it. You always have this knack for like, okay, we see this as a problem. How can we fix it? A lot of us can identify problems, but very few of us can actually come up with tactical solutions. And so I absolutely love that about you.
Thank you. That's my oldest daughter syndrome. So
I think it's really exciting how, you and your team especially realize, have a broad enough vision to realize the importance and the need for patient advocacy, and the role for it. Can you give us some insight into the specifics of what patient advocacy looks like in terms of how you operationalize it, how you incorporate patient and caregiver insights into Ardelyx's work? What does it look like practically on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think there's several examples, and again, I said that this concept of patient centricity had to be woven throughout every sort of phase of drug development, and so when I think about it, on both fronts, like in the kidney space as well as the GI space, right? And I start at the beginning from a discovery standpoint. One of the things we asked on the kidney side was, what are the things that patients really need? What is deterring them from getting to their goal? And so that was then a charge, right, to our discovery team about where they would, sort of innovate. I think carrying that forward, we got patient insight in our clinical trials. We made sure that the patients who were impacted by the disease were actually included in our clinical trials, had the highest number of, sort of demographic diversity based on patients who actually have the disease than most clinical trials ever done. That was important. But at the end of the day, again, when we had to defend all of the clinical data, we had reams of, data showing safety, showing efficacy, all that stuff. But we also had patients telling their stories. And again, Johanna and I always talk about this, but, Brene Brown says that, these patient stories is like data with a soul. So we incorporated patients throughout the whole process. That's on the kidney side. The same thing happened on the GI side. When we talk about, diseases like IBS-C, irritable bowel syndrome with constipation, we didn't want to just take care of the constipation. We knew that patients also had a number of additional abdominal symptoms that were really bothersome to them. And so we asked questions like, what is your most bothersome symptom? How can we address that? Will our mechanism of action look at some of those things? And we incorporated those things in our clinical trials. We incorporated questionnaires that looked at quality of life. And as a result, we're able to, again, get the drug across the finish line and actually get it into the hands of patients. So that's how we do it on a practical basis, and we do it with our patient advisory councils. I think the other piece, though, that is very important is that, again, yes, it's one thing to get a drug approved. It's another thing to make sure that patients have access. And I think one of the things that I am most proud about is that we have, a very robust patient assistance program that helps to make sure that those patients who are uninsured or underinsured and who need the drug, who are prescribed the drug, can actually get it. And so I think it's a combination of all those things. And hopefully, the examples that I've shared will show you that, again, the patient insight is utilized from the beginning to the end, throughout the whole process, from discovery to clinical trial development to commercialization.
I think that one of the most beautiful things about the way that we approach everything that we do at Ardelyx, with the patient voice being front and center, is that our actions match our words. And
Yes.
they build trust amongst patient communities. And if your actions are counter to the things that you're saying, or that are the cliche phrases on your website about patient centricity, but your actions don't match that erodes trust in
Right.
patient communities. And trust is like your key ROI, right? Like, if you don't have patient trust, then you have nothing. You can spend all the money in the world on your marketing and on your promotion of your therapeutics, but if there's not trust, there's nothing. And so I think what is so beautiful about us is that everything that we do with our patients is embedded into all of our work, which then is rolled out into the actionable insights within the communities. And that is what is building the trust, which is so key for these patients who, to your point, have been for many, many years not given appropriate care and have huge unmet medical needs still. And so I just think it's so important that when you talk about ROI of patient advocacy, where so many advocacy functions are being dialed back within industry, and not seen as a key function in terms of the business, I think that's really short-sighted. And for us, it's really important part of our work. So I love it. Obviously, I think it's critical to everything that we do. And I really love that our executive leadership agrees and that you're in this role, Laura. So I know we're getting short on time. So as we wrap up, I would just love for you to summarize what is the ultimate impact of putting patients at the center of drug development and work within pharmaceutical industry work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously we've talked a lot about, sort of what that does, but I think for us, it drives our business model at Ardelyx. It's, as I said before, it's not only the right thing to do, it is a driver of our business model. We try to make sure that our decisions, our strategies, and our actions are all organized around the needs, the experiences, the preferences, and the values of the patients that we serve. And so, I think when we decided that we wanted to amp this up even more by, creating a chief patient officer role that reports directly into the CEO, we understood that what we were trying to do was, again, keep the patients, along with their families and their caregivers, at the forefront, because that accelerates actually our work, and it steers us, I think, toward a more urgent, efficient, relevant, innovative research and development. Again, it drives everything. If you practice patient centricity, it actually allows you to create a strategic, and meaningful clinical development plan, enroll trials earlier, get drugs hopefully into the hands of patients sooner, drugs that actually have a meaningful impact on their outcomes. And so, um, I think that, again, this was not only the right thing to do, it is a huge step forward for patients. And I'm just excited to be in the role, and excited for sort of what it looks like going forward.
For sure. So I wanted to share with our listeners that Dr. Laura is going to be my guest co-host in February of 26. As we have a live podcast recording for February. Dr. Laura and I will be speaking with a couple of different patients live from one of our company meetings, and we're really excited to bring their stories to you together and continue to highlight the voice of the patient and the importance of patient insights and patient advocacy as a function within Ardelyx. So be listening for that episode coming up in a couple of months. And I'm really excited about that too. So as we sign off today, Andrea, thank you so much for being my co-host on this episode again this year as we close out the year. Thanks to all of our listeners for a great season. We've had some wonderful guests, and we have talked about some really important topics related to IBS-C and patient care. Excited for the next season, Andrea, as we open up with a new season and new guests and new topics. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.